Welcome to an edition of CCSD Living Environment. Today we're going to look at measuring with metric. So what we need to look at first are some of the units and what we measure when we use those units. So we'll start off with meter, which we use M to measure length, which is the distance from point to point. Grams, or G, we use to measure mass, which is the amount of matter. Liters, or L, we use to measure volume, which is the space that the matter occupies. Celsius, or degrees C, we use to measure temperature, which is the average kinetic energy of that matter. Remember that kinetic energy is the energy of motion. So if you're taking the temperature of something, what's really happening is the bulb of that thermometer, the particles are hitting that bulb. If they hit them very slowly, then you've got a lower temperature. If they hit very quickly, then you have a higher temperature. So really you're measuring the motion that's happening around that thermometer. The measuring instruments that we will use in the laboratory are all marked in metric units. So we've either got meters, grams, liters, or Celsius, some version of that. The scale has numbered lines on the instruments, and those lines are called graduations. So maybe the light bulb went off and you're thinking graduated cylinder. So the cylinder is the shape, and they call it a graduated cylinder because those lines, those markings on the side, they call graduations. So let's look at a couple different examples. In this case here, I'm measuring from 1 to 2, and there's 10 lines in between, which tells me that each line is equal to 0.1 or 1/10 of a unit. So based on where my volume would be, this would be 1.3 milliliters. In this case, I'm measuring from 10 to 20, and again there's 10 lines, so now that means that each one is equal to 1 whole unit. So where my volume is here, that would be 17 milliliters. Here I'm going from 1 to 3, but there's only 5 little lines in between each group, which tells me that each line is equal to 0.2 or 2/10 of a unit. So in this case here, my volume would be 2.4 milliliters. And then here, from 10 to 30, again, there's 5 lines in between each one, which tells me now they're equal to 2 whole units. So where the volume is there, that would be equal to 18 milliliters. So the most important thing for you to do, whether it's a graduated cylinder or a thermometer or a triple beam balance, whatever the instrument is to check and see what kind of a scale do you have. Are you doing it by tenths? Are you doing it by ones? Or is there only 5 lines, so it's going by 2/10 or by 2 whole units? That's the most important piece to remember. So let's start off then with that graduated cylinder. The graduated cylinder is used to measure volume. If water is poured into the cylinder, remember you get that curved surface in there that we call the meniscus. The volume readings need to be taken from the bottom of the meniscus, and they need to be at eye level. There's a picture in your note packet that shows you the curve. So you have your graduated cylinder, and when you pour water in there, it forms a little curve. That curve is called the meniscus. So when you take your reading, you need to move your body down, so you're at eye level, and you're looking right at the bottom of that curve. That's how you use a graduated cylinder to measure water. The next one we're going to talk about is a metric ruler. We use a metric ruler to measure length. Metric rulers are divided into centimeters and millimeters. Remember, 1 meter is 100 centimeters. 1 meter is 1,000 millimeters. So what does that mean then? 1 centimeter is equal to 10 millimeters. So when you look at a metric ruler and you go from 1 to 2, there's 10 little lines between 1 and 2. 1 and 2 are the centimeters. The little lines in the middle are the millimeters. So what I'd like you to do quickly, right in your note packet, is go ahead and convert for me these different measurements. So you've got 4.2 centimeters. Write down how many millimeters that is. 15.6 centimeters. Write down how many millimeters that is. Now let's do it the other way. 58 millimeters, how many centimeters is that? 287 millimeters, how many centimeters is that? The next one we're going to look at is the triple beam balance. The triple beam balance we use to measure mass. Remember, the balance compares the mass of the object with the mass of known objects that we call weights. One beam represents the hundreds place, one beam represents the tens, and the final beam represents the ones. The mass of the object is determined by adding together the mass of each slider scale. You'll have practice using a triple beam balance, so you just have to go through, and once it's balanced at 0, you just have to add up the numbers. So if you had 100 on the hundreds, you had 40 on the tens, and you have 5.7 on the ones, what's the mass of your object? And you should be telling me 145.7 grams. Remember, you have to have units whenever you take a measurement. Don't forget your units. And the last one that we're going to talk about is a thermometer. We use the thermometer to measure temperature on the Celsius scale. The most important ones for you to remember, and they're a great reference point for any of the questions that you're going to be asked this year. 0 degrees Celsius is where water freezes. 100 degrees Celsius is where water boils. 37 degrees Celsius is human body temperature. This is the one that's going to trip you up because we're so used to Fahrenheit. So when it asks you about body temperature, you have to give them Celsius, and that's 37. And then 22 degrees Celsius is what they consider to be average room temperature. So let's put that into the Fahrenheit scale we're used to. So that would be 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's about 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So these are the two that give you a really good reference if it asks you about different temperatures of things, especially outside. So if they tell you, oh, well, it was a 40-degree Celsius day, well, obviously that's not around here because that's almost 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So you've got to be someplace down south. Or if they tell you it was about 25 degrees Celsius, that was 70, maybe 72, based on the difference between human body temperature and average room temperature. So you can use those to kind of help you figure out what they're talking about in Celsius with what we're more familiar with in Fahrenheit. That takes us through some information for measuring with metric. I hope you picked something new up today, and I'll see you next time.